Hi everyone. So let's begin this presentation. We're going to talk today about grant writing and design. So what I mean by that, in the world of research, many times we need to realize that research is very expensive. And in order to do research, we need some sort of support, whether that be financial, um, resource support, even team support, etc. When we look at the financial component, many times researchers go for grants, and grants are a way given by some sort of third party, whether it be a governmental organization, a private organization, or maybe it may even be an internal grant where your own institution has funding sources. So today we're going to talk about how basically we submit a request to grants or grant associations in order to hopefully get our research funded. So that's why I'm going to start with kind of the grant basics. So within the United States, there are some major sources of grants. And again, grants are essentially awards, usually financial awards, that are intended to help with some sort of project. In this case, we're going to talk about research, but there are a lot of different grants out there. There could be grants to improve an infrastructure of an institution. There could be grants geared towards program development. There could be grants even geared towards buying equipment. And the list goes on and on. From a research standpoint, typically what we see is there are grants at the federal level. So in the United States, this comes from the federal government, from organizations such as the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, United States Department of Agriculture, etc., etc. We can also view grants that come from states. Within the United States, we have 50 states, such as California, Hawaii, etc. And they also commonly provide funding, and we would be applying through a state grant. Relatedly, there may be municipalities. So we're going from the US government to US states, and now to counties or towns may also have grant funding opportunities. And then the fourth component is a private foundation. So an organization that's not affiliated with some sort of governmental position, but is usually a nonprofit or some sign of organization, such as the Bill Gates Foundation, geared towards providing grants to research. And so that's the major sources of grants within the United States. Another component that I mentioned too is that there may be some what we call internal grants. So if you're at a university, there may be what we call mini grants or other awards that you can apply that are funded by the institution itself. The list that's provided on the slide, those are what we call external grants. So you're applying to organizations external, i.e., outside of your organization for grant funding. Now, with this, what I'm going to continue with too is this presentation specifically focused talking about external grants. And when we go for external grants, more times than not, those organizations, those grant funding sources are going to provide guidelines, instructions, and the mission and purpose of the funding. This is going to be seen at the federal, state, and local level, as well as private foundations. And commonly, what we call this is an RFP. An RFP, which I'll have on the next slide, stands for Request for Proposals. So typically, there is some sort of promotion that this organization has a funding opportunity and are looking for applicants, almost like a job posting if you think about that. And like a job posting, there are an explanation of what the funding is going to be, as well as the qualifications and the requirements that are needed for that component. And there's also going to be most likely than not a deadline of when this RFP is due. So the thing to remember when we're talking about grants is grants are competitive, especially if we're going for federal grants. There are many times The larger the grant, the more competitive that's going to be. So what I mean by that, the larger the amount of money, it means there's probably going to be less people who will get that award, which means it's going to be more competitive. I share that because in the world of grant writing, there's a lot of people who are going to sell you the services to you. And understand too, it's important to realize that many times grant writers will share their success rate. So it's a percentage of how many grants they've written and how many been awarded. It's important to understand that their percentage rate is going to extremely be impacted by the types of grants you go for. So a research grant has a much lower percentage rate than, let's say, a grant that's, regarding food services or equipment or, a new van for a local nonprofit, etc. Um, in addition to that, too, the level is going to vary as well. Going for a federal grant is way more competitive than going possibly for a local grant that may have more awardees but less of a ceiling for the grant amount. So what I'm saying with this, in the nonprofit world, you may have someone who goes for a lot of local and private foundations that has a pretty high success rate for grant writing. Likewise, you may have someone who goes for large federal grants whose percentage may be low. Let's say one about every 10. Now, the percentage is going to be different, but it's hard. You can't compare the apples and oranges to this. Rejection is a part of the process, especially going for research grants. A successful statistic is, again, 1 out of 10. It's estimated that you're doing something well if you're getting 1 out of 10 research grants. Now, again, that's referring to the large federal funding sources. In addition with that, I want to stress research fields are going to vary on the level of grant opportunities that are out there. So, for example, if someone's in the biomedical field, there's going to be a lot more resources out there, especially at the federal level, than someone who, let's say, studies organizational psychology or leadership development, or in my background, research ethics. There's less research ethics funding sources than there is comparing to studying cancer. So understand that if we're having less opportunities, obviously our percentage rate of successful grants are going to be impacted by this. So I share all that preamble because it's really helpful to remember that rejection is part of the process. That's what's annoying with grants. So it's very helpful to, in the early stage, understand that, hey, we're going to put probably a lot of time and effort for applying for this grant. And there's a greater chance than not we may not get this. There's a lot of factors that go into whether or not a grant is awarded, and we'll talk more about that. And many times those factors are out of your control. So again, it's helpful to get comfortable with the rejection, especially when we're talking about going for grants. Now, what I'm going to shift with is talk about some strategies to help improve our odds, and more importantly, help us make sure that we write the best grant proposal we possibly can. Because even if we get rejected, there is still a sense of satisfaction that we did our best. So, the thing to remember, what's different than writing a grant compared to a science paper or a research article, is grant writing is about communicating something that hasn't happened yet. Usually, when we're reporting science and research, we're reporting something that's already taken place, and then we are chronologically essentially describing what happened and why. Grant writing is not that way. Grant writing is about communicating a future of possibility. So we do that by stressing the vision for the grant, what we are looking for to have happen with the funding. The viability is how possible it is to make that vision happen. And then if that vision occurs and happens, what's going to be the impact of that research? So that's what we are talking about. We're talking about how do we communicate our vision when we go for grants. So to help understand the vision that we're going to communicate, the possible viability and the impact, this is where we really want to get involved and really understand the request for proposals. So a good suggestion is you're going to read and reread the RFP a few times. Take notes, highlight it, have it somewhere that's easily accessible on your computer. So if a question comes up, and again, grant writing is an iterative process. There's going to be times where questions or ideas change, so it's always helpful to refer back to the RFP. So when we're reading the RFP, it's really helpful to understand many components, the specifics of the RFP. All RFPs can be unique. Okay. So even if we're dealing with the same federal agency, within the agency, they have different awards, or they call different programs, essentially. And even within those programs, there may be different ways you can apply and receive different funding sources within that program. So, for example, we could have a program from NSF that is a multi-year, multi-million dollar project, but there could be sub-elements within that project. So it could be traditionally we're going to apply to the multi-year institutional grant where we're going to improve our infrastructure. Or if within the same program, we could also apply for getting training or workshop developments, which would be a one-time thing and much less than the multi-million dollars. Or it could even be a possible career award where the individual receives that funding rather than a team or a group. And so with all within a program, there could be various levels of funding opportunities. In addition, sometimes, even before you submit your grant proposal, some grants will require what they call a letter of interest. Basically, this is like a screening process where you submit, and sometimes it's a few pages, maybe less, maybe more, to a grant source. And then if you are accepted, they will then request that you submit a full proposal. Sometimes a letter of intent occurs when there's an expectation that there's going to be a lot of applicants possibly, or there's a limited amount of awards. And so this is a screening process that can help narrow down the element. And again, a thing to remember, let's say your letter of intent is accepted, that does not necessarily guarantee that your proposal will be accepted. So that's one element. Is a letter of intent required or some sort of introduction or to reach out to let them know that you're planning to going for this grant? Sometimes some grants contact that you have some previous contact with the grant source. Related to that too, really important to understand what's the budget? How much money is this award going to be? And really, I'm not going to go deep into this lecture series right now, but um, budgeting is really important. And there's a lot of factors, especially if you're applying through an institution. The award amount is going to be broken up into different components. There'll be salary components, so whoever is getting paid on this grant. There's going to be an indirect cost component, which right now in the United States is very complicated and there's a lot of changes going on with this. But essentially, there's a certain amount of the money that's going to go to the institution, and then there's the amount of money that's going to actually go to the research itself. So understand the budget element. Just because it's saying it's a $1.3 million grant does not mean all that money is going to go straight towards your research process. So I share that from experiences of working with researchers who sometimes don't understand how that budget is broken up into different categories. And then that can really impact their research design. Because designing something with $1.3 million in mind to realize that you're going to get half of that or maybe less is going to impact the equipment you may want, the tests you're going to do, the procedures, etc. So understand your budget and how that's going to be broken down at your institution is very helpful. And again, check eligibility. Certain grants have restrictions on who can and cannot apply, or they may very emphasize that we're looking for certain institutions or certain groups, excuse me, to apply. So just read to make sure that you're eligible for the grant, because it would not be fun if you spend all this time and effort to something that you're not even eligible to possibly get. And also, there may be other unique requirements for every grant source. So, this is why I'm stressing really be aware of the RFP. And you're more than welcome to always send questions to the grant funding source. Doesn't mean they'll answer them, but you can always reach out to them and ask them for further questions. One of those clarification questions could be of really understanding the funding source's mission. A lot of federal sources, this is easy to find. There's going to be some sort of web page or document describing the mission of a federal agency and especially the program that they're offering grants through. Private foundations, this may not be as easy to find, so this is when asking, someone at the agency to describe what their mission is for this grant funding source. So again, really understand the mission of what they want to do because that's how we can communicate how our research and the impact that research may have aligns with the mission of the organization. Your your ability, or excuse me, your opportunity or chances increase if your grant aligns with the mission of the funding source. And then finally, really be aware that there's a lot of strict requirements when we're submitting RFPs, especially at the federal level. There's going to be strict deadlines, okay? These are very hard to get leniency with, except for extreme circumstances. And there's a lot of formatting rules, okay? So these are non-negotiables. So late or non-compliant applications, especially at the federal level, are automatically rejected. I've seen it happen at times before where a team works very hard on a grant and they submit it, but they have some sort of minor formatting issue and it gets completely rejected. Again, we want to really be aware as we're doing this, making sure we have formatting all up to go and that we're meeting the proper deadlines. So with this too, a lot of times, a lot of funding sources, you upload documents and then they have software to determine whether or not the formatting is correct. Sometimes you'll get specific instructions to improve the formatting. Other times the instructions may not be very helpful. That's why, as I'll talk about in a later slide, you really want to give time built in to submitting a grant. Don't wait till the last minute to submit it. There can be errors in the submission process that may take some time to resolve. So it's helpful. A good rule of thumb that I've seen done before is you start submitting 3 or 4 business days before the grant's even due, uploading the paperwork to make sure that it's been approved by those systems and that the formatting is correct. So with this, as I talked about, we really need to know the funding source, okay? And then likewise, we really need to know ourselves. Yeah, our backgrounds, our research experience, our abilities to do research, our career directions we're going, etc. And why I bring this up is because reviewers, okay, tend to assess the grant submitter's qualifications, backgrounds, expertise, and previous research. Again, I'm mainly viewing this from a federal standpoint. When you apply for grants, especially at the federal level, you're including your CV, resume, whatever you want to call it. Some like NIH require bio sketches. More and more agencies are requiring, or I shouldn't say requiring, I don't know if it's fully requiring, but they recommend you have an ORCID ID number attached to that as well. So there's more requirements or recommendations to show your qualifications, backgrounds, and previous research experience. So if you're someone new in the career or may not, or be applying to a grant that isn't your forte, that doesn't necessarily negate you from applying. It may be okay. It may be time to get into collaborative research and have people on your team that may be beneficial or show the expertise with this as well. And as I talked about, rejection is common. And what is common practice too is you may apply for a grant one submission cycle. So that may be every year, maybe multiple times a year, whatever it may be, depending on the funding source. But if you get rejected, that doesn't limit you from reapplying. for the most part. That's a good rule of thumb. There may be some exceptions to that, but you can always reapply. And what's helpful, especially at the federal level, is you get feedback from the reviewers. I've been on grants before that we've been rejected, but some good feedback we got. This was a research ethics grant that they would like to see an official bioethicist on our research team. So we took that. We eventually added a bioethicist to our team and then resubmitted and then got the grant awarded. Okay. So I share all that because we need to know ourselves, and then it could be a way too of finding ways, our own limitations. How can we add that to our team? So that's the thing to remember. There's a lot of assessment of our funding sources and assessment of ourselves and our teams as well. So now we're moving on to grant design. Okay. So we read the RFP, we got our team ready to go. Now we're going to talk about, okay, what are we gonna do if we get this grant? Okay, because many times that's going to be included in your grant proposal, a plan of what the future is going to be. And having a detailed plan, again, it's just better odds of a reviewer reading it and be like, oh, this sounds great. Let's go forward. So when we talk about grant design, it's almost, especially for research grants, it's synonymous to talk about research design. So I really stress figure out the details now. Okay. When you're designing something, really think about it. And don't say, to be determined or, whatever, we'll figure it out once we get the money. No, no, no. You want to figure it out now. That's going to save so much headache in the future. So, what I mean by that, who on your team is doing what, when, and why? Okay. Even discuss about, publications. Who's going to be first author or whatever that equivalent may be depending on your discipline. So you talk about authorship, you talk about what possible conferences you may present, how are you going to get this information and share it with other relevant stakeholders and resources, right? And then, so really, plan out how are we going to collect the data? Where is the data going to be stored and managed? How are we going to analyze the data? How are we going to share the data? Who owns the data? Again, all of this important discussions to have. Related to that, too, as I kind of skipped ahead, but you really want to talk about exploring and describing the impact of the research. And then finally, you want to develop a contingency plan. Anyone with experience doing research knows research never goes the way you expect. That's the process of science, right? We test, we retest, new hypotheses or experiments are developed. It is an iterative process with new emergent elements that occur. Nothing goes to plan for the most part. So how best can we could develop a contingency plan? In social science research, okay, let's say we have a specific population we're going to study. Well, it may be helpful in our design process say, hey, what's the backup plan if we don't get enough participants from this group? What other recruitment strategies would we utilize? Are we going to use compensation for their time? Are we possibly going to recruit another element? Do we need to tweak our research design geared towards a smaller population? Do we need to really evaluate our interview or our surveys? Is that going to be a possible barrier, etc.? Always have a possible contingency plan. And sometimes it's worth describing that contingency plan in your proposal because this would show that one, to funders, you've really thought this through, and two, you're really dedicated to make sure you're still doing high quality research. Funders want to fund projects that they think is going to be successful, meet the mission of their organization, and again, is money that is not wasted. Okay, so we designed our grant. Okay, now we're going to talk about writing strategies. How are we going to communicate that design? So, the biggest thing, and again, you've probably heard this many times before, but the thing to remember is you want to tell a very compelling, logical, and easy to follow story. The other thing to kind of break through behind the curtain is there is a strong probability. that there's going to be a reviewer on your review committee, who is not an expert in your field. Okay? So that's almost a guarantee. Depending on the funding source, you may have one, three, five reviewers. There's probably going to be someone who doesn't really understand your field well. Okay? So that's why we really want to emphasize telling an easy to follow, logical, compelling story. So a way to do that is we can explain what's new, novel, or game-changing about our research proposal. Maybe we're using a new approach, a method, or a model, or maybe having a tried and true experiment, but with different variables or different populations. Something that has to be new, engaging, that kind of component. What is unique about the situation? And then why does that matter? Okay. So, and we tell it in a very logical, easy to follow element. Maybe have some graphs, some pictures. Really, repetition can be really helpful. We're going to do this because of this, and this is what we expect to happen. And then with that, really stress the potential impact of science, public health, and or society. So going back to summarize a writing strategy, we want to it's a tough challenge of writing in a way where someone not an expert can understand what we're going to do, and at the same time, still demonstrating our expertise and qualifications to do this. Okay. One strategy I have found this way is the language you use is going to be accessible to whoever reads it. So don't use jargon. Really simplify the best you can complex ideas. Because again, that itself shows their understanding, especially to someone who may be an expert in it. But clarify, simplify, really get into the vision of what you're planning on doing. And how you demonstrate expertise is actually through who you're citing and referencing, who you're acknowledging. So we want to communicate by clear, understandable languages, and we show our expertise by our citations, our references, and who we are acknowledging. So with all that, okay, grant writing takes time. Obviously, I hope so. So going back, we have to find funding sources. We then have to read our RFP to make sure our research designs aligns with that component. And then finally, then we have to start writing the process. So with that, I want you to budget time for designing the grant and writing it. If you're working on a team, schedule team meetings. It can be helpful. If you're in person, have a whiteboard. Bring some cookies, bring some juice, whatever it may be. Make it a fun environment, but really have brainstorming and then outline all of that. If you're meeting online, really dedicate time to design the grant. And again, talk about roles, responsibilities, who's doing what. Really break down the whole data life component. How are we going to collect data, analyze data, store data, disseminate data, use the data for future use, etc. Really give time to developing the budget and budget justification. So you really, again, in you going for grants, they're going to want to see, is what you're asking for really justified? So describe why this money is needed. Could be in a narrative form, could just be in a kind of a spreadsheet component, whatever it may be. With that too, as I mentioned already, there's a lot of documents that are required, especially at the federal level. This may be resumes, CVs, bio sketches. And then as we're in the era of collaboration with multiple team members, even multiple institutions, you may also need a letter of collaboration. So what that means is you may be at one university and you're going to work or share resources with another university. That other universities are probably going to need to submit a letter of collaboration, and that can take time as well. In addition, if you're going to put all this work for it, get some feedback because again, The whole point of this is you're going to have someone who is reviewing your documents. So what's helpful is practice a mock review. Have colleagues, and again, it could be helpful to have someone who's been on review panels, maybe not, maybe, but have someone review your full proposal and then compare it to the RFP criteria. Now, this is a big ask. So do something nice for this person afterwards. Maybe do some quid pro quo. Maybe you'll review their future grants, but also respect their own time. Okay. These are multiple page documents, sometimes going from 40, 50, 100 pages. So respect their time. They're really given a lot of their own effort to put into this, and it can be really helpful, especially when you're getting feedback. Ask, was this understandable? Did you understand that? Or is the way we could, is there anything that's confusing or doesn't align or isn't congruent? Really, again, we want a logical flow element that really gives some sort of clear communication of what we're planning on doing. And as I mentioned finally as well, do not wait till the last day to submit. Technical and administrative errors are very common, especially when you're submitting to certain sources. So it's very helpful to submit several days in advance. So I want to finish too with some common strategies for going for grants. So we have these components of leveling up versus persistent targets. Okay. So what I mean by that, one strategy is, especially if we're starting off new in our career, or we're building a new research portfolio, is start small. Okay. You're going to go for smaller grants, less competitive, increases your chance. And then maybe we use those grants to pilot our research, especially if we're developing an idea that's novel or new. We need to demonstrate that this idea is worthwhile or that it's effective. So we go for smaller grants. Now we have some data, and then we can build up to other grants. And then sometimes it can be helpful too to communicate that there's different parts or phases of our research. Phase one, we're going to go for this grant. If we get this grant, this will lead to phase two, phase three, etc. Again, you're still communicating a vision of how all these various elements come into play. So you're slowly working up to larger and more competitive grants. Now, that's very common, especially in the biomedical field or, fields with a lot of funding opportunities from different areas, whether it be federal, state, local, etc. In areas where you may have very limited funding opportunities, leveling up may be difficult. In that case, if you find a funding source that you align with and aligns with your own missions, it may be helpful to do a persistent target. So what I mean by that is, okay, this is the funding source we need to go to. With the persistent target element, understand that it maybe takes some time to get that grant. This is what's helpful when you get feedback. Even if your grant gets rejected, you get feedback, you readjust, and you keep resubmitting. This can take, multiple years, unfortunately, but again, this can also be a strategy. But I recommend this strategy when, again, you don't have the ability to level up. So you may be in a field that has limited funding source opportunities, and so there may be only one or few resources available or sources available. So being persistent can be very helpful. With that as well, if you're going for specific persistent grants, this is when networking becomes very helpful because most likely, if it's a field that there's not a lot of funding opportunities, means there's probably not a lot of reviewers out there, or you may already be in circles with those reviewers. So presenting at conferences, really getting your name out there, demonstrating your expertise can be helpful in assisting in that persistent target strategy. So, to provide a quick summary, again, be familiar with the RFP and the funding sources, mission, and purpose. That's very clear. Start early on with that. And with that, align your proposal to meet the needs and requirements of the RFP. Sounds simple, but again, you'd be surprised how this doesn't always happen. Related to that, give time for grant design and feedback. I know as a researcher, you're busy. There's so much going on. I understand that. And there's also times I will admit that you may not become aware of a grant, or you may be told to go for a grant with a very short window. That happens. That's a part of the research life. When you're not in those constraints, though, give yourself time for the grant design and feedback. And then also be strategic with your grant submissions. Are you going to level up or do you need to be persistent? So I'll end there today. Thank you all. I hope you have a good rest of your day. And I'm going to end here.